Ooh. Ooh. Ta-da!
Hello, artist friends! Have you ever wondered about or wanted to try watercolor brush markers? If so, this video is just for you! The M&G Signme markers have dual brush and fine bullet tips. They come in sets of 12, 24, 36, or 48. They do not seem to be available within the United States anymore, but can still be found on a couple of sites listing the price in Pakistani rupees. I'm pretty sure I purchased my set of 24 on Amazon prior to 2022. That year, I tried these markers out working in a small 5x7 sketchbook. The thin, water-resistant paper of that book worked really well with these markers. The Robocop coloring was done on printer paper, and the markers worked well enough. This combination color chart and stress test was created on light cardstock and designed to allow up to 5 layers of ink for each color in order to see how much range I could get versus paper damage by coloring an area more than once. Unfortunately, the felt tips are very scratchy, and after only 2 or 3 layers of color, they were lifting fibers out of the paper. Regardless, some of the colors were able to show 4 to 5 distinct tones by layering, which is good even though the surface did not hold up to the testing. I chose the 8 primary colors of the set for further exploration of the marker strengths and weaknesses. This includes 2 yellows, 2 reds, and 4 blues. This modified color wheel was designed to test the marker's coloring and blending performance across multiple surfaces. We will be testing the markers on copy paper, light cardstock, marker paper, Bristol board, and finally cold press watercolor paper, which I was barely able to force through the printer. Starting with the flimsiest material, copy paper, I colored in the color wheel with the 2 yellows, 2 reds, and 4 blues. I also attempted to create some blends between the colors with minimal success. This was due both to a combination of the paper and my lack of experience with the markers. I noticed that the markers were also smearing the printed black lines, which was very undesirable. The inks visibly bleed through to the backside of the copy paper pretty easily, although they did not penetrate to the undersheet I was working on. There was some lifting of paper fiber, which will worsen with additional layering attempts. I do not recommend using copy paper with these markers for anything more than flat or simple coloring. When blending, the marker tips become contaminated with the color they are being used over, and this needs to be cleaned before working in new areas, or the mixed color will transfer over on the next few strokes. Fortunately, swirling the tips in water clears the contamination easily. On light cardstock, the markers perform slightly better with the ability to achieve some blend effect. The issue with the printer ink remains, and unlike copy paper, the light cardstock lifts and chunks when saturated with ink, creating paper turds all over the place. Attempting to brush these away can cause streaks and splatters. The ink visibly bleeds to the backside of the light cardstock, but again, it doesn't penetrate all the way through and does not carry to the undersheet. I would discourage using this material for more than flat coloring due to the heavy fiber chunking, even though it did also allow for a bit of blending. The Bristol board handles the marker ink well. During blending, I noticed a bit of fiber building up. Unfortunately, the printer ink issue is far worse with the Bristol board, and I can only assume that the less absorbent surface is the culprit. There is no visible bleed to the backside of the Bristol board. I would recommend using Bristol board with these markers for flat, simple, or basic coloring. Anything more than basic coloring, though, will probably result in too much of a mess. Marker paper yielded the nicest blends so far. Unfortunately, because marker paper does not absorb ink very easily, which allows you to blend on it, the printer ink issue is even worse than it was with the Bristol board, and I had to be very careful to avoid touching the printed lines with the markers. Since the marker paper is made for blending, I am also very surprised to find fibers being lifted up out of the paper. Overall, I would recommend the marker paper more highly than Bristol board, and with practice, it might even be able to support my advanced coloring technique. Prior to starting with the watercolor paper, I saturated it with water, and that actually caused the printer ink to lift up, smear, and wipe away, which was actually helpful to the rest of the process. Working on the saturated cold press watercolor paper was very nice with a single pass. The colors laid down smooth and consistent without leaving visible marker lines, which is better than I've had on any other surface so far. Once I began working on blending colors with the markers and a water brush, things got interesting and ugly. I definitely overworked the paper and ink with the water brush, but I did get some blends and caused a lot of bleeding and centipeding beyond the black lines. I continued to lift fibers from the watercolor paper with these markers, which is highly annoying. Off camera, I experimented just a bit more without adding any more water and was able to achieve a little bit better blending and smoothing in the worst areas. The felt tips are very scratchy and seem to be the reason that the markers tear fibers out of every surface material. I hope you can hear that scratchiness. That's the bullet tip. And now for the brush tip. You hear all that noise? So far, I like the potential capabilities of these markers, and I think they could be a nice asset for creating tighter line work in watercolor painting. As for coloring, I would not recommend them for anything more than basic coloring, although a careful and practiced hand might be able to use them for advanced coloring, or more. In one final test, I will attempt to use these markers to create a watercolor painting on the watercolor paper. I'll be back with my final thoughts after this test. I printed out the bear owl on cold press watercolor paper with light gray lines to help the painting stand out more than the line work. Starting with the background, I laid in a bit of blue-green and used a wet craft sponge to create a wash effect, as I want the background to have some gradation of color from light green to almost black near the top. I use a water brush and a regular brush to help spread the color a bit closer to the wings and work in the tighter areas. With the green spread to the extent of my fog effect, I apply a lot of darker green to the background with the markers. Some red in the top section helps to darken and desaturate the color to a near black, while yellow-green helps to knock down the intense blue near the fog. Using a wet brush, I create some softer blends and attempt to level out the scratchy marker lines. Next, I move into working on the bear owl, using light red to add a warm tone to the bear, light brown for overall color, and dark brown for lines and shadows. It is at this point that I realize any subtle coloring with the M&G markers has to be done with minimal touches of the marker and a lot of spreading and blending with a wet brush. It is also very easy to oversaturate the areas with water, creating undesirable bleeds and centipedes. Continuing to work through the bear, I have mixed results due to oversaturation, attempting to add details too soon, and failing to wait for areas to dry before working next to them. Working on the flowers, I quickly achieved some nice painterly effects. Some positive things about these markers are the firmness of the brush tip and the very fine bullet tip, both of which allow for the creation of clean, saturated lines. I am really pleased with the simplicity of coloring the mushroom tops and the clean change between the red and the white. Working on the underside, I again failed to wait for the colored area to dry before adding fine lines, which resulted in bleeding centipedes. Using these markers effectively will take some more practice. Painting the bear owl again with Crayola watercolors is pretty much the same process as before, but I am a little rusty with watercolor and just remembered to start with my lighter colors in the background this time around. Now, this time around I also refrained from using the water brush, as it has the same lack of flow control that I've been finding with the M&G markers, and every stroke of a water brush is depositing water, which can quickly flood the working area and create undesirable effects. Working through the background and grassy foreground, I primarily focus on using wash techniques to apply fairly even color to the areas, while working on blending the different colors of the background together. Getting that dark pop of contrast at the separation between grass and background is really important. Keeping in mind the failures I experienced with the brush markers, I make sure to bounce around the image a bit more this time, getting the flower centers done, and then going back to the rear wing of the bear owl once the background has dried a bit. Next, I work on the closer wing, laying in a general light brown, enhancing the lines that separate the feathers and adding the initial stages of shading. Once I notice the area getting a bit too wet, I switch to the tail feathers to allow the wing to dry up a little bit before coming back to it. I use a gray-blue to add the feather markings and further saturate the brown while smoothing away any washed out spots from the previous pass. Moving into the body of the bear owl, I use a wash of light yellow to tint everything and a light wash of pink or light red to add some warm shading to the body forms. Dark brown deepens the shadows and areas are pushed toward black with the gray-blue that I used in the feathers. If you watched my basic and advanced colored pencil coloring tutorials, much of this will look familiar, as the theories of undertones and coloring remain the same between mediums. I decided to lay down a wash of light blue on the tops of my mushrooms and work that color in more deeply around the edges and in the shadow of the form. This will add more depth by tinting my reds that I will add later toward violet. While I let those areas dry, I darken some spots on the bear and then begin working on the flower petals. Now, I did work dangerously fast on the different flower petals, moving directly from one flower to the next, and was lucky that they did not bleed into each other. Next, I finish off the grass, loose flowers, and rocks before painting the underside and stems of the mushrooms. Some of the loose flowers needed a bit more definition, so I touched those up and then go back to the mushrooms, working on their tops this time. Lastly, I add some more dark detail to the rocks, deepen the shadows on the bear owl's wing, and add my signature. This Crayola painting took a little bit longer than the marker painting, but I think they might have turned out equally well if I had gone slower on the marker painting. So, I really like the potential of these markers, and upon carefully reviewing the video of my painting process, I realized that I was trying to move too quickly, which resulted in a large portion of the failures I experienced. That said, I absolutely hate the felt tips which tear up every surface they come into contact with. If you are just getting into watercolor, I highly recommend learning to use the medium with a brush and water before attempting to use or incorporate these watercolor markers. Now, if you already understand and work with watercolor regularly, these markers might be able to speed up your production process and make the addition of fine details easier. Personally, I really like using these markers for simple color concept work, and I think that's how I will continue using them in the future. Finally, you can compare the two paintings side by side to see which you like better and make your own decision whether you would like to try these markers yourself. This video brought us into the realm of watercolor brush markers and watercolor in general, so my next two videos will continue to explore similar products from Arteza and Color It. I am curious to see if they fare better or the same as this set. Frank, in answer to your question, yes, you can create dark fantasy art with Crayola washables. Until next time, happy coloring. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Join me on Patreon, where you will gain access to full-size, high-resolution image downloads, a special look behind the scenes of my projects, regular updates, monthly fantasy coloring pages, and more. Patreon.com/EricPerkinsArtist. Discover a world where art comes alive at ericperkinsart.etsy.com, your destination for original art, digital downloads, and more. Dive into a gallery filled with the imagination and talent of artist Eric Perkins. From breathtaking originals to digital downloads that spark creativity, there's something for every fantasy art lover. If you're looking for instant inspiration, our digital downloads are just a click away. Elevate your projects with high-quality downloadable art that reflects your style and vision. Visit ericperkinsart.etsy.com today. Embark on a coloring journey like never before with Fantasy Coloring Book Number 1, A Coloring Adventure. Immerse yourself in the magical world of 32 intricately designed pages, each a masterpiece waiting for your personal touch. Whether you're a seasoned artist or just discovering the joy of coloring, Fantasy Coloring Book Number 1 is the perfect canvas for your creativity. Let your imagination soar as you add your personal flair to these enchanting illustrations. Order yours today and unlock the door to a world of fantasy, one page at a time.